Hello everybody, and this is my homework about literacy. I read 3 books: Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Fantastic Mr. Fox, and the Twits. From those 3, I like the Twits because it has funny characters and their acting is good. My favourite characters is Mrs. Twit, Mr. Twit, and the chapter. I'm going to tell you some information about them. And the chapters, a little bit of chapters I'm going to read is Mr. Twit and Mr. Twit, and Hairy Face and Spaghetti one, and Miss Twit, I think. Hairy faces. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. Mr. Twit was one of those very hairy-faced men. He had hair except his forehead and his eyes and his nose, and he had hair all over his ugly, and he was disgusting and smelly. I would like to meet him. Do you know how often Mr. Twit washed his face? The answer is never. He would never, not even on Sunday. He hasn't washed it for years and years. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She was ugly, hairy. Of course she was not. She didn't have a hairy face. She was not that hairy, but she had a little hair. But she wasn't covered with hair like Mr. Twit. But of course she didn't have a whole face like Mr. Twit. Do you know why Mrs. Twit was changing uglier and uglier throughout her life? If a person had bad thoughts, every week, every day, every year, then it changes. So she was beautiful when she gets uglier, and the most ugliest until you can't even bear to look at her. If a person has good thought, then though they have a wonky nose, cropped mouth, sticked out teeth, though they all shine out like sunbeams, and they will always look lovely. You know when Mr. Twit done his frog trick, and this is now Mrs. Twit's trick to pay him back. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back from the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big ones, long ones, and put them in thick ones, thin ones, and put them in a tin and carried it in the house under her apron. You know when Mr. Twit had the shrinks, Mrs. Twit had the shrinks, it's time for her to get stretched. So Mr. Twit had everything ready. He had balloons and his stuff ready, and he got at least 50 balloons stretched up in the sky. The amount of stars I would give for this book is 100 out of 100. Thank you for watching, everybody.